For decades, the United States has shifted between confrontation and cooperation, often slapping Canada with countervailing and anti-dumping duties on softwood lumber without solid evidence. Let's be clear, Canada does not dump lumber into the US. When President Trump raised tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber to nearly 35% this August, he accused Canada of flooding the US market with cheap wood. But the numbers tell a different story. Nearly 70% of all softwood lumber imported into the US comes from Canada, a supply chain built over decades to serve everything from new home construction to emergency rebuilding after disasters in states like California. What Trump didn't say is that America's own logging industry isn't built to replace that supply. The US might have the trees, but it lacks the sawmills and workers to process them at scale. Industry experts told Fox Business that it would take 5 to 10 years to build up enough domestic milling capacity. And that's only if federal restrictions on forest access were eased, which is politically and legally uncertain. With countervailing duties set to rise soon and the looming threat of a Section 232 investigation, total costs could easily surpass 35%. Americans will find out quickly just how much those duties impact them. The effects aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they're already hitting home, literally. Economists, including those cited by Investopedia, estimate that higher lumber prices could raise construction costs by 10% to 15%. In wildfire-prone states like California, where rebuilding can't wait, that means families will face higher prices, longer delays, and fewer housing options. And it's not just disaster recovery zones. From suburban neighborhoods in Texas to apartment projects in Illinois, developers are rethinking their budgets and timelines. Trump once pledged to boost home building to ease the housing crisis. Now, his tariff policy might be one of the reasons new housing is becoming less affordable. Softwood lumber is a cornerstone of Canada's economy. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't lash out. Instead, he acted. His government rolled out over $1 billion Canadian dollars in support for the lumber industry, a package combining loan guarantees, grants for product diversification, and worker assistance. The largest chunk, 700 million Canadian dollars, will be available to small and medium-sized companies struggling after 8 years of trade uncertainty. But Carney's plan wasn't just about money, it was a strategic pivot. He linked this funding directly to a new $25 billion federal housing program launching this fall, ensuring Canadian lumber will be used to build affordable homes at home if the US won't buy under fair terms. The message was clear. If America shuts its door, Canada will create its own demand. The US could try to boost imports from countries like Germany or Sweden, but neither has enough supply to replace Canada. US mills are already running at full capacity with no backup. That's why Canada's calm, measured response stands out. Carney's team is pushing diversification, trade missions to Vietnam and Japan, expanding market reach beyond the US. As British Columbia Forestry Minister Ravi Parmar put it, the US will soon feel the consequences, not just in trade numbers, but in the real-world cost of wood, homes, and materials Americans depend on. What Trump framed as a tough trade move might end up hurting America itself. Canadian producers now have the resources to survive, time to adjust, and political support to evolve. Carney's government is also preparing transition programs for 6,000 workers, not because the industry is collapsing, but because it's adapting. And as Canada adapts, the pressure shifts to Trump. Higher costs, delayed projects, and frustrated consumers point to one truth: Canada didn't flinch, it built. In this standoff, the winner might not be the one shouting the loudest, but the one quietly laying foundations. Yet Trump's team insists Canada must open its market or face tariffs. With the deadline for trade negotiations approaching fast, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick warned that if Canada doesn't give ground, tariffs will hit. Ottawa, however, is standing firm. Carney is working with U.S. senators and Canadian provincial premiers to find a narrow deal. Not a full rollback, but a targeted agreement to avoid broader economic harm while restoring stability, even if some tariffs remain. One old dispute is suddenly at the center: softwood lumber. British Columbia has dealt with U.S. duties for years, but for the first time, Canadian officials, including Premier David Eby, are open to export quotas as part of a settlement. That's a big shift, as quotas were once off the table. But with over $7 billion in tariffs sitting in escrow and talks at a breaking point, lumber is now a bargaining chip instead of just a casualty of U.S. trade policy. Why the shift? Because softwood offers a rare opportunity for a quick win. It's high-profile, mutually dependent, and politically weighty without touching more sensitive sectors like dairy or autos. As one Canadian observer put it, this is Trump's strategy in action, creating leverage through disruption. But Canada's playbook this time is different. Trump's trade approach is deliberately chaotic, with shifting deadlines, unclear demands, and threats to reopen USMCA in 2026. Former New Brunswick Premier Brian Gallant called it engineered confusion. Canada isn't responding with chaos of its own. It's answering with discipline. Provinces are aligned. Ontario defends its auto sector, BC brings lumber to the table, Quebec demands clarity. Federally, Canada is strengthening its economic base. Bill C-5 aims to break internal trade barriers, and a major projects bill focuses on infrastructure, energy, and mining, with Indigenous partnerships at the core. Internationally, Canada is deepening ties with Mexico, the EU, and G7 allies. The message is unmistakable. Canada won't depend solely on Washington. Tariffs have already pushed up U.S. construction costs, especially in markets reliant on Canadian lumber. Lawmakers in Washington are feeling the heat, with a bipartisan group of senators visiting Ottawa, not to issue threats, but to preserve stability. The longer the standoff drags on, the faster Canada reduces its U.S. dependency. Here's the paradox. The harder Trump pushes, the more Canada becomes self-reliant and strategic. This isn't just a trade fight. It's a test of political discipline and national resilience. Lumber might seem small, but it symbolizes something much larger: the ability to hold ground, make smart concessions, and protect sovereignty without theatrics. Trump's tariffs may still land, but the blowback won't stop at Ottawa. It'll echo across American job sites, political offices, and financial markets. In the end, Canada's quiet resolve might shape the outcome more than Washington's loud rhetoric. The deadline is now hours away. Without a deal, Canada faces a 35% blanket tariff from the U.S. starting tomorrow on goods outside the free trade deal. On August 1st, Trump followed through, imposing those tariffs on products labeled non-compliant with KSMA. The move was pitched as a power play to punish Canada for stalling. But one major sector, Canadian oil, was left untouched. While steel, aluminum, auto parts, and copper tubing were hit, crude oil, which accounts for 50% to 70% of U.S. oil imports, was spared. Canada sends over 4 million barrels a day south, most of it refined in U.S. Midwest plants. If Trump really wanted to hit Canada hard, this wasn't it. This wasn't by accident. Canada's export profile has been shifting. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce says over 80% of its U.S. exports are KSMA protected, including oil, natural gas, key foods, and many jointly produced auto parts. Even Trump's 50% copper tariff had limited effect because Canada mostly exports forms like cathodes and anodes, which weren't covered. By aligning trade flows with KSMA protections, Canada didn't just weather the tariff storm, it sidestepped it. And that's where we stand. What began as a straightforward tariff fight has revealed something much deeper: a battle of patience, strategy, and endurance. Trump's 35% tariffs might make headlines, but they haven't crippled Canada's most important exports. Oil still flows, key industries are still protected under KSMA, and the core of the trade relationship remains intact. Canada didn't just survive this round, it adapted. By strengthening ties with new markets, securing its own housing and infrastructure projects, and protecting sectors Washington didn't touch, Ottawa turned a defensive position into an opportunity. The U.S., meanwhile, faces the reality of higher construction costs, frustrated developers, and political pressure at home. This standoff isn't over. Talks will continue, deadlines will shift, and both sides will keep looking for leverage. But the last few months have shown one thing clearly. In modern trade wars, the winner isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the side that keeps building, keeps planning, and refuses to be rushed into a bad deal. For Canada, that patience is paying off. For the United States, the question now is whether the cost of winning this fight will be worth it. If you found this breakdown helpful and want to keep following the story as it unfolds, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Traveling Vibes. Stay tuned, because this trade dispute is far from finished, and the next move could change everything.